Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. We're going to begin this session devoted to Colombia on this World Day for Lawyers at Risk. We are going to be having 4 different languages: Spanish, English, French, and Italian. They'll be interpreted, and in order to listen to the interpreting, you'll see that on the bottom of your screen you have icons, and if you click on the icon of the globe where it says interpreting, there's a pop-up menu, and there you choose the language where you'd like to listen to. But there are also instructions on screen. Now, as a moderator, I'll also say that in order to work properly, we're going to have to be very rigorous with the time allotments. So I will ask all of the speakers to please stick strictly to their allotted time. The president of the International Observatory for Lawyers at Risk, Mr. Francesco Caia, will now have the floor to open.
Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alfredo. I would like to greet all the renowned speakers at this conference. This is a conference that we have organized on the occasion of the 12th International Day of Lawyers in Danger. This is something that we hold the 24th of January every year. I would like to greet all the colleagues from over the 40 bar associations that are members of our International Observatory, and all the lawyers of the bar associations that are members of the International Coalition for the Day on the Lawyer in Danger, together with all the others who are online. Ever since 2009, the Day of the Lawyer in Danger has taken place on the 24th of January with conferences and events all over the world in several cities. And the 24th of January was chosen as this International Day of the Lawyer in Danger because on this very day, in 1977, 4 lawyers were murdered in their firm, Caia 55 in Madrid. This is an event that is now known as the Atocha Massacre. Unfortunately, this year, the pandemic hasn't made it possible for us to hold a conference in presence. This is what we would have liked to do. But despite the difficulties that have to do with the international health crisis, our commitment to lend our support to threatened colleagues because they are practicing their profession is still going strong. Our commitment is still going strong, and thanks to the new members in the observatory, we have increased our activities. The pandemic has deepened inequalities, but it certainly hasn't stopped the violations of human rights in so many parts of the world that take place, with macroscopic violations of the rule of law and due process. This leads us to believe in our objectives. We are determined to reach them. Lawyers in Colombia, just like in so many other parts of the world, are targeted because they are the natural defenders of human rights. To silence them, they're usually identified with their clients by authoritarian governments that don't hesitate to arrest them and indict them. As members of the the World Day for the Lawyer in Danger, last year we committed to coordinate and to encourage the drafting and publication of a final report on Colombia. This is based on the experience of Colombian colleagues and a close analysis of that state. Over 25 have cooperated, for example, bar associations that are signatories of the same. At the end of this conference, I will report to you on the requests and recommendations that we should conclude in our report. I would like to thank everybody for their commitment and devotion because they have contributed to the drafting of this report, and more particularly the members of the observatory. In Colombia, the commitment of lawyers that are concerned about fundamental rights is unbelievable. In 2016, the signing of the peace accords in Havana between the Colombian government and FARC was promising, but it didn't really put an end to the armed conflict. However, we know that negotiations with the National Liberation Army have been suspended, and the paramilitary groups and the drug trafficking is still on the increase. So it's very difficult to find the right authority to govern all this because it is very difficult to defend the underprivileged and the more vulnerable. In 2021, the Observatory has submitted an appeal, amicus curiae, to support at the Colombian Constitutional Court the appeal which referred to Dylan Cruz, a youth who was murdered by the National Police. At the beginning, the military criminal jurisdiction was considered the authority, but the Constitutional Court on the 17th of June 2021 considered that the authority of criminal justice and military criminal justice is limited and exceptional, and therefore changed the forum, the authority. Lawyers in Colombia are threatened. They are attacked when they take care of sensitive files, especially the ones that refer to land restitution, illegal expropriation of peasants, and extrajudicial executions. The reprisals against lawyers increase, and whenever lawyers denounce the link, the bonds between the paramilitary groups, the guerrilla, and the authorities. Today, we have lawyers Franklin Castaneda, Germán Romero, Lina Peláez, and Daniel Mendoza. And it is our colleague and friend, Alfredo Irojo, who will introduce them to us. And then Mr. Joel Hernández, the Commissioner and Rapporteur for Colombia for the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and Mr. Diego García-Sayán, the Special UN Rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers. And I give him the floor right away for his delivery.
Good day. Good afternoon to all of you. I would like to thank you for having given me the opportunity to share with you some thoughts, and of course, beginning by paying tribute to the victims of that terrorist attack in Atocha 45 years ago, after which many places around the world, not only in Madrid, have seen similar attacks to their free practicing of their profession. I hope that the audio is okay. The regular practice of law is one of the components that the UN Special Rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers takes up, to the extent that the international community, since in the 90s this Special Rapporteur was created, the practice of law freely is an absolute prerequisite of the rule of law and an independent legal system and upholding human rights. It's concept that's part and parcel of that. States must uphold and safeguard the profession, the legal profession. And of course, this has to do with the very practice of law. The second aspect that all of you are well aware of is that despite the fact that these general principles have been laid down around the world, there are practices that undermine the free practice of lawyers, and specifically when the practice is devoted to defending human rights, women's rights, indigenous people's rights, and issues that have to do with analyzing corruption, organized crime, and the environment, which very particularly in Latin America is increasingly vulnerable and putting human rights defenders and lawyers alike in danger. According to the information that we have at our offices between 2010 and 2020, more than 500 lawyers have been killed or kidnapped around the world in different regions. I presented back in 2018 a report on an aspect of the legal profession, which are bar associations, and analyze the different forms of interference, coercion, and how this plays into the free practice of law. I am currently preparing a report that I will prepare in June this year to the Human Rights Council, and it has to do with the subject that we're dealing with here today, the free practicing of law. And I've received very, very valuable information from different countries around the world. One of them is Colombia. And naturally, we are commemorating the Day of Lawyers at Risk, but I'd like to express my solidarity with all of the different men and women lawyers who have been struggling to uphold human rights. And my words of solidarity to those who have fallen victim and those who have been victims of attacks. In addition to the standards, well, there are a very broad amount of standards laid down in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. This was adopted by the United Nations in the 1990s. The Declaration of Human Rights Defenders adopted by the General Assembly in 1998, which it doesn't refer exclusively to all lawyers, but does touch upon their practice of law. And I believe that Mr. Hernandez will talk about this more later on. There are different aspects in the Inter-American human rights system, the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights, and the broad-based case law on this subject in both the Inter-American Commission and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Over the last few months, there have been several debates and meetings with different lawyers in Asia, the situation in the Philippines, in Africa. There are issues in Zimbabwe, and in Europe as well, because there is a crisis and there are threats in certain countries in Central Europe. These are countries and situations that are well known: Poland, Hungary, Belarus, where men and women exercising, practicing law are threatened. In this process, holding dialogues with lawyers in Europe, with the Council of Europe, there's a significant issue that has arisen, and I'd like to share it with all of you today. And this is beyond the standards that we already have, the European Convention on Human Rights, which is broad-based and general. The Council of Europe is exploring the possibility of having an international instrument. Some believe that it should be a binding instrument, a treaty to protect lawyers. And in that context, that instrument could be open to including countries that aren't Council of Europe members. And progress has been made along this road. The latest information that we have is that this year, in the first half year of this year, we will have a committee of 15 experts that have 2 years to prepare this international instrument. We don't know whether it will be a binding treaty or some other type of instrument. And in that process, as invitees, certain organizations and peoples may be able to participate. And I'm happy to share with you that one of the entities that was invited to participate is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Independence of Judges and Lawyers. I will finish my term at the end of this year. So what's important, of course, is not the person herself or himself, but the fact that the rapporteur will be doing this. It's very important that notwithstanding the instruments and tools that we already have, for there to be a binding tool that is driven by Europe and that other countries in other regions around the world can join as well, in a context where the multilateral system isn't seeing its most wonderful days. It's not all that easy for there to be instruments like this arising internationally or even in the inter-American system. I don't want to come out with elements that will be written into the report. We have excellent talks ahead of us to illustrate the threats faced by lawyers in Colombia. But what I would like to do is go over certain patterns of attacks, harassment, and interference with the practice of law that are not only taking place in Colombia, but all around the world in all the different regions with differing levels of intensity. Just to try to outline things, I can talk about 4 different elements. First of all, constant ongoing victimization of men and women who are lawyers defending human rights. Not just practicing law in general, but particularly working on human rights. And very specifically, the attacks are in Cameroon, China, Egypt, the Russian Federation, Philippines, Guatemala, Lebanon, Morocco, Palestine, Iran, Tajikistan, Turkey, Rwanda, where there are ongoing attacks to lawyers defending human rights. Kazakhstan is another question. Now, over the last few weeks, there's an institution that most of you know, SEGIL, has promoted and already published the so-called Protocol of Hope, which is an instrument. It wants to be an international instrument to protect human rights defenders, whether they be lawyers or not. And it certainly is worthwhile using that Protocol of Hope to bolster lawyers' potential work. Secondly, we have cases linked to internal or domestic security. And this, again, happens around the world: Turkey, Myanmar, Iraq, perhaps a bit less in Latin America. And here we're talking about cases where there are courts that have that examine domestic security issues such as terrorism, and many times the lawyers involved are or end up being victims of persecution. They are, of course, defending their clients. This has happened in Turkey. It's happened as well in Burmania and Myanmar after the coup d'etat there in February of last year. And in Egypt, there are many, many lawyers there that have suffered waves of attacks to defend Islamists in cases that have to do with domestic security. Thirdly, there's another pool or group suffering attacks. And these are cases that have to do with investigating corruption, major corruption that has been established as an international crime. There is a UN convention on that. And oftentimes they are dealing with criminal structures. There's retaliation for lawyers who investigate, who promote legal action in Equatorial Guinea, Guatemala, and Venezuela, just to add two countries in our region of the world. And, of course, there are countries in other regions. And fourthly, last point, not in terms of its importance, but just last in the list, is identifying lawyers with their clients. And this is one of the biggest obstacles to freely practice law around the world, be it in Colombia, elsewhere in Latin America. There are environmental leaders, others who are defended in sensitive cases that may have to do with environment, minorities, LGBTQ, other politically sensitive issues. And the lawyers themselves are identified with their clients. For instance, in the Russian Federation, where a lawyer for a dissident, Ivan Pavlov, is now behind bars for defending someone who didn't like Mr. Putin. So today's agenda is very heavy. And I have a note that we're told that we can barely hear you. I don't know whether I should continue to speak. I hope that you can be heard. I hope I can be heard, rather. Yes, I can hear you perfectly well, Diego. Yes? Okay, fine. So, well, and I don't want to be long-winded, but there are several different instruments and concepts that are crucial. And I'll just quickly mention 6 to see how we can defend ourselves on these attacks. First, we have bar associations, when there are bar associations, which are crucial for lawyers in their practice. And, of course, these bar associations must be independent. When it is aimed at, as in Turkey or in Belarus or in Lithuania, when their regulations are interfered with, that in itself is a grave affront to their independence, and there may be sanctions. Just from the standpoint of the bar associations. And then there are physical and psychological attacks that lawyers and their families receive. And that brings me to the third point, which is the media. Sometimes the media are attacked. Fourthly, we have disciplinary procedures. Sometimes this occurs within the judiciary or in political spheres. Sometimes There's political control exercised over these bar associations. And in Brazil, there's a very serious case, binding ruling by the Supreme Court, and there's a technical defense in a disciplinary proceedings, and that lawyer has no right then to defense. And this is a very serious precedent, very delicate indeed. And lastly, of course, professional secret, a breaking and entering, seizure of different objects. And this happens in many countries around the world. There are grave cases of breaking and entering, pulling away entire files by the police in countries that are indisputably democratic, Belgium, Croatia, or even France. This has happened. Hinging around a case of tapping of Le Point newspaper or magazine. So I wanted to share this information before we get into the specifics of the legal practice in Colombia. I just want to set out an overall global context as we see it occurring around the world. Secondly, I want to stress the need for solid tools that we need in order to interact and face grave threats that may be replicated in our own countries, in Colombia as well. And finally, how we respond to this. We need to reassert the principles, basic principles adopted by the United Nations more than 30 years ago. And of course, we need to lend attention to a binding instrument open to countries beyond the Council of Europe. And this is a debate and process that's worth following up on. I don't want to belabor my presentation any longer. I want to stick to my time limit. But again, I'd like to share my deep and loyal solidarity to all of the lawyers who have been struggling so hard to uphold the principles of the rule of law, and particularly in transitional justice. Hopefully they will be able to fulfill one of the raison d'etre of this transitional justice. And sooner rather than later, hopefully there will be a broad-based, solid system, not only in Colombia, but in all of the countries in our region, in Latin America. Thank you very much. I'm available for any comments or questions. And of course, subsequent debates that I might be invited to. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Diego, first for your words reminding us of the Atocha lawyers, and for the words that you spoke about lawyers at risk around the world, and also how much you press the importance of independent bar associations. It's true that all lawyers at risk around the world deserve our attention, and there are many, many countries that require this. You mentioned many of them. But today, for our World Day for Lawyers at Risk, we're going to focus on the situation of Colombian lawyers. They are the ones that this day has been devoted to. Next, I am delighted to present Mr. Franklin Castañeda, who is going to help us understand the context in which practicing law in Colombia takes place. Franklin Castañeda is a Colombian lawyer. He's the president of the Committee of Solidarity of Political Prisoners, which is the longest-standing human rights organization in Colombia. For his work as a committed lawyer, Mr. Castañeda has suffered intense stigmatization and risks to his bodily safety. Thank you, Franklin, for being with us. Whenever you like, you have the floor.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. I would like to greet all the people that are following us right now. And we, of course, would like to be part of the lawyers community that are following us. And we would also like to hope that these kind of events will not be repeated anywhere throughout the world. You are very important. It is now 12 years that you've been working on this, and you've been still celebrating this day. The focus is Colombia and how our profession works in our country, and this should be food for thought at this point in time. I would like to break up my presentation in three parts: the socio-political side of the armed conflict in Colombia. Secondly, I would like to talk about social protests and how the Colombian context has an impact on the practice of law, especially the lawyers that defend human rights.
En noviembre del 2016 firmamos.
As you know, in 2016, we signed peace accords in Colombia. This is something that should have put an end to a great part of our armed conflict. That is, armed conflict between the state and the FARC revolutionary forces. At the time, it was the oldest opponent of the state against the Colombian government. It was about 50 years there was this opposition. Now, with the signature of these accords, people felt hopeful, and the defenders of human rights hoped that all of the Colombian establishment would be involved. Unfortunately, the Colombian people decided to elect a government which conducted its campaign based on the peace accords. And the current government that is almost over, the government of Ivan Duque, has been working for the past 4 years on some ideas. One, to obstruct any progress, and to reduce the peace accords to just paper, nothing meaningful. But that the peace accords would not turn into what we wanted. So this obstruction and this sabotage of the peace accords has led to very bad consequences. The fact that Colombia has gradually gone back to more trouble, more conflict, and a situation where the figures that I'm going to share with you are very meaningful and take us back to about 20 years ago with regard to bloodshed and armed conflict. In Colombia, in 2021, due to that failure of the current policy, 96 massacres occurred, and that was beginning in 2000. 338 people were murdered in these massacres. In the 24 days of this year, 10 massacres have taken place in Colombia, many murdered. So this is a very complex landscape, the landscape where our country, unfortunately, has gone back to its worst times. But conflict also referred to forced displacement, according to the United Nations, during the previous year, from January until November, date of the last report, 72,300 people were displaced, fleeing from armed conflict and trying to save their lives in 159 landscapes, armed conflict, for example. So what we see is a very serious failure of the current policies. 22 new groups have emerged. Some are paramilitary or drug trafficking groups. There's another one, the one that's called the Plan del Golfo for the government, and these are the conquerors of the Sierra. These are paramilitary groups, and they are now being noted in the country. So a country that has 1,002 municipalities, now we have about 300 groups in most of them. So most of the municipalities in Colombia have the presence of armed groups. 27 of our provinces have groups, paramilitary groups, armed groups, rearmed groups. And unfortunately, this situation is lingering on. And this troubled situation does lead to several risks on civil society, and more specifically on organized civil society. Over 100 members of civil society civilians have been murdered in the past year, and we have a high figure in terms of lethal violence. This was the first achievement that we had seen in 2017 after the signature of the peace accords, when Colombia had the lowest figures, the lowest murder figure. But unfortunately, that has changed in the past 4 years. And last year, that was a more violent year in terms of lethal violence in the last 20 years. So what do things look like now? This is something that we've already witnessed. Most of the Colombian people that protested and that were against corruption, violation of human rights, and scant guarantees in social rights, that led to an unprecedented economic crisis. 3 months of protests in the main cities of the country, in particular in one city that was sort of the capital of rebellion and dignity in Colombia, and I'm referring to the city of Cali. It was really the capital of all that. This is one of the main cities in the country, and thousands, maybe millions of people participated in the protest. And the reaction of the government was deplorable. First of all, they stigmatized a lot of people. On the one hand, repressive action on the part of the state forces, and also the fact that there were open violations of human rights. We've seen all over the world the fact that the police were shooting on a defenseless population. We now don't know whether it was state agents or paramilitary groups that were acting, or maybe emerging a combination of the two. And then we had all around the world the images of the police and the fact that the police were really violating human rights. They were attacking people. There are 24 people that are still considered disappeared. 89 persons were murdered in the previous year. And more seriously, again, it was a city of Cali where 36 people were murdered, over 1,000 persons were injured, and some people have lost their eyesight. And all this was due to police action. 106 reports to the police for sexual aggression and women that were endangered. 123 people were attacked for defending human rights, and over 120 journalists were attacked in these events. And also, the reaction or the vengeance against the people who organized this led the government state to using the judiciary in order to undermine the prestige or renown of people there. And there are many people that have been arrested in Colombia because they were organizing the protests, and not only the major protests, the one I'm referring to, but also the protests that have taken place, for example, against industry and others. And now I move on to the third and last part of my presentation. Our parliamentary landscape is very special in Colombia, and this affects the practice of law, and especially those who defend human rights. I'm going to focus on some patterns of how this arises. First of all, there's a public attitude towards armed conflict. There was something that they called a legal war. This is the kind of idea that the Colombian government promoted so that all the lawyers that were defending human rights would be considered part of the armed conflict. And they said that we play a role in armed conflict, and that is to undermine the legal aspect of the police and all the government forces. And they do that with a view to they said that all these forces were trying to take over power. And so the intelligence of the state now consider lawyers as part of the conflict. And I'm referring to the lawyers that defend human rights. They consider lawyers as an armed part of the conflict. And when just to give an example, when we denounce false positives, for example, 1,400 youths that were murdered by the armies, we did that supposedly to undermine the authority of the government. And when there were when torture and police violence was reported, that too on the same level. So on that basis, in order to attack the integrity of lawyers, they do get to what they want to get to, what they target. They are targeting us because they want us to be considered as the ugly people, if you wish. And this is confirmed by the fact that we are defending human rights. And then there's another idea that arises, and still in the same framework of this confusion, of this way of misleading people in order to misjudge, there is something else that arises. What is explained judicially and publicly, what we say, we lawyers, what we say to protect human rights and to defend human rights. And recently we have seen this in the social protest in Colombia, and this has been confirmed by the kind of misleading attitude by the government. And there's a more specific part to this. There are international and national groups that are friendly with terrorism, and these groups not only act in the armed conflict, but they work inside civil society in order to achieve these protests. And we, who are defenders of the people who are falsely accused, we are wrong. Because our objective is to make all that a failure. So that stigmatizing of our work not only leads to undermining our prestige, but unfortunately that also leads to a great deal of attacks. And on that note, I would conclude between January 2019 and April last year, 6 Colombian lawyers had been murdered. Many have been threatened. Another 6 had to move out of the country in order to to save their lives, and some had to live in exile. So I believe that this situation deserves the attention of the world. I'm very thankful for this day that is devoted to us. Thank you.
Yes, Franklin.
Thank you very much, Franklin, for this dramatic information that you shared with us, and that helps us get an overall idea of the very sad reality of lawyers that defend human rights in Colombia. Thank you very much. I will now present the next speaker to you. Germán Romero is a lawyer who represents victims of extrajudicial executions, and he belongs to DH Colombia, a human rights organization. He represents victims of grave violations of human rights in cases where the national army is being examined and working within the specific jurisdiction for peace. And Mr. Romero has had to temporarily go into exile, given that there have been several attacks against his person and his family. Germán, you have the floor. Hello. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Yes. Well, I'd very much like to greet the observatory and everyone who belongs to this observatory in defending those of us who are defending human rights. And I would also like to send a special greeting to all of the families who are at risk together with us. And another very special greeting to young women lawyers who are a big generational change. They are really taking on most of the risks out on the streets, out in the fields, for defending the environment as well. And also lawyers who aren't institutionalized, who are defending communities. They're working in small towns and can't participate in events like this. Now, I'd like us to think about why there's persecution of people practicing law at the service of human rights and peoples, and what the consequences of this are. I'd like us to analyze why this is happening and whether any changes should be made. In other words, is there a relationship between a healthy and a perverse system in Colombia and those who are using the system in Colombia to defend rights? Because the legal system is used against those who are upholding these rights. We need to ask ourselves whether in Colombia we have an open, healthy, and functional legal system in Colombia, and whether that's behind the persecution. We have, this may happen to other defenders as well, we see two things. There are barriers to accessing the administration of justice when there are crimes committed, and there are officials that belong to the criminal structures within the army and access their files. And then there are intelligence operations where we have acts that have to do with common criminality or armed conflict, but they aren't actually. They have to do with the government and those questioning criminality, corruption, and then we have other cases. We have attacks against the police. Franklin spoke about this in DH Colombia when there are crimes of covering up that we are trying to fight against, that's when we are persecuted. We need to demand that companies, and particularly multinational companies, pharmaceutical companies, extractive companies, when we are working in cases that involve these players, the risk is very, very high. They have very nice faces, so to speak, in North America or in Europe, but very different faces in Latin America. There are arms structure and there are economic groups that are affecting certain companies. This is in the first place. And secondly, when we attack in these actions in Colombia, within Colombian justice, there is a huge amount of militarism. And this is present in transitional justice associated with the peace agreement, and that had existed with the 2005 peace agreement. There's an unevenness. Victims and their representatives are looked down on. And lawyers have to be up to the task of promoting cases. They need to find forensic evidence, present witnesses, and they need to request charges. And criminal law is sometimes not recognizing certain crimes. We need to drive on constitutional action so that there is due diligence within reasonable deadlines in the cases of rural communities, indigenous communities, and other victims. That is when we are persecuted. From DH in Colombia, there are generals and colonels. For instance, Apartado de San Jose, that community is one clear example. And we have had our computers stolen, our files were disappeared. And when we have requested through special justice for peace that when we are demanding truth from military or paramilitary groups, this is when we're threatening. When we are defending public prosecutors who are combating these practices, that is when we're prosecuted. When we have our security cameras taken because we are involved in cases attempting to prosecute police officers that have abused their station. And there are more than 30,000 persons disappeared in our country. And when we have worked on this, that is when we were persecuted and when we've had to go into exile. In all of these cases, in ordinary and transitional justice, the job has not been done, and it's the lawyers who are trying to drive it forward, and taking on the risk of upholding the rule of law, which is leading us to be persecuted. And we have the political cost and the cost in terms of safety that we are paying, and it's the state that should be safeguarding these rights. This makes it clear that we have a travesty of justice in Colombia. Underneath it all, what I'm denouncing here is that there is a negation of the rule of law, and there really isn't any at all when victims and their lawyers are attacked. The Colombian Constitutional Court has been recognized as progressive, and it censured the Apartado de San Jose community. There have been precedents like this. there are perpetrators that are walking the streets, and those who are defending against these crimes have actually been killed or are prevented from going to the doctor in months and months. There are no investigations into the chain of command. This has happened in Bogota or in small towns. Colombia lawyers have to double up on their protection when they actually work on documenting cases of protests on the street. We are being taken to court for upholding the law ourselves. We want there to be an actual rule of law. We're concerned that there have been steps backwards, actually. These mechanisms are farther and farther away from the victims. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Germán.
Thank you very much, Germán, for your engagement and your courage as a lawyer defending human rights. A former president of the Spanish Bar Association used to say that each law firm should be a human rights office in itself, and that goes to show through the words that you pronounced, sir. Now we're going to hear from Lina Yahay Pelaez, who is a lawyer and an anthropologist. She's a human rights defender. Lina belongs to the social and legal team in the Nomadesk Association, working for more than 20 years to defend human rights in one of the most conflictive areas in Colombia, the Valle del Cauca and the Cauca. In her work as a lawyer for Nomades, she has been working with indigenous communities of Afro-descendants and also those from the Southwest. She represents victims of grave human rights violations committed by the public security forces between 2019 and 2021 by the police. Welcome. You have the floor whenever you'd like.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. I would like to greet all the people that are now attending this conference, maybe online, and more specifically the International Bar Association and the Nomadesk people. In the framework of the context that have been depicted by my other colleagues, I would like to focus on the association and how we have experienced the defense of human rights from the point of view, the legal point of view at our Nomadesk. It's interdisciplinary. This means that there is an interaction with other disciplines, lawyers and the law and other disciplines. And I believe that we have clear-cut examples that have historically led to a great deal of progress, because we have worked with communities, because there's a judgment. There are several judgments dating back to 2012 and 2015, one for the Department of Cauca and one Buenaventura, where there is a great deal of progress. Because this is where we have the greatest action. We have made a progress in opposing the development model. In other words, there's a case of there's a judgment by the Constitutional Court. We have been able to save some industries, for example, the Argos Group, and that has cost the life of many of our community, especially the native community, the indigenous community, and the Afro-descendants who live there. And now the human rights are really complied with it. That's why we would like to call your attention to this kind of endeavor, because we have been successful because we have defended groups of people that compromise our own disciplines, because in practicing our profession, we need to be more inclusive. And that is why we would like to highlight the work that has been done by the association. And we believe that there is a lot in terms of education to do as well. We believe that it is important to look backwards to see exactly what was done, what has been done, and where we have made progress in the defense of human rights in this country. For example, we do have some examples of a trailblazing person that was murdered simply because of his defense. And we would like to highlight the lawyers that maybe don't hold a law degree from the university, but people that have been exiled from the municipality of Buenaventura, and someone who was murdered, and Álvaro Chupe, who was a trade union leader, and he was also trying to defend human rights, and he was fully committed to a legal framework for his strategy. All this links up with the risk that organizations such as ours run. We live in a context which is very difficult, and the reason why the Colombian people are now turning to many international organizations, where many of my colleagues have already mentioned this, in the international context. And this means that we are present in several places, because we need to represent victims, for example. Today, our association has the possibility of defending the families of people that have been harassed by the national police. And there are groups that give their assistance in extrajudicial executions and attacks on women, and there are victims that have really suffered, and we have tried to get together a lot of the people that are involved. And in a more specific case, there is a possibility, an avenue is opening up before us. We dream of justice, but the blocks are always there, blocking our way toward more justice. For example, investigation, the prosecutors to be on the right side. Well, there are many people that are involved. There are two officers, one from the National Police and one August. And at the end of last year, they have helped us out. They have helped us, and we have had their assistance. And I do believe that there should be a word of praise for these officers, because they have tried to help. To us, in representing our victims, we believe that what is satisfactory also is to guarantee justice and non-repetition of the cases that we know of. For this reason, and I'm sorry for speaking too quickly, but I would like to conclude saying that we identify some persecution and harassment of some people, and that was documented in October last year, prior to this court hearing, and youths that are being attacked by prosecutors and persecuted because they participate in the social protests. And Cali is one of the more affected cities, and the department that in Cauca were also affected by this because of the attacks by the government forces and the judicial persecution. the association was persecuted last year, and there was persecution and harassment because they tried to tap our communication. We had bugs all over, and we really realized that the national police was recording and registering documents around our offices, and the prosecutors were really going ahead with this. We applied for help. We asked for investigations, and we tried to ask for investigations that were being attacked and used in this kind of operation. We have also tried to document the use of technologies that target identifying different defense lawyers, and there is a theft of information. And we went ahead with our actions. We asked, what about the use of the new technologies? How does the state identify this system to persecute us? And we identified a threat which might not really be directed, but we identified the technological items that are used by the state, and that means that we are at a total risk. And the prosecutors have acted together with the government forces. We try to see how we can guarantee the practice of the profession and to guarantee the rights of people and victims to have some sort of defense or protection from this kind of crime. But we realize that the judiciary is not on our side. There is nothing that guarantees justice, and there's nothing that guarantees independence of the judiciary. That is why we welcome this kind of event, so that we can together see what is the best international tool for the defense of human rights, because we need a tool that we might protect both victims and lawyers. This is the reason why we also welcome the progress that were mentioned by the Commissioner for Education, and we hope that the end result is going to be binding for Colombia. And this is our experience, and this is what we can say about Colombia without omitting the crisis that was mentioned then, that we live in our territories and which hamper our defense of human rights. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Lina.
Thank you very much, Lina, for your courage, your commitment, and for having shared your testimony, your direct story with us. I'll now give the floor to Mr. Daniel Mendoza Leal, who is a criminal lawyer. He's also a journalist. He founded the online publication La Nueva Prensa. He's been practicing for 20 years now in Colombia, and he has acted both in Colombia courts and the Supreme Court in Colombia. He's written more than 200 articles denouncing corruption of the elites and the relationship between narco-traffic and paramilitarism with the elites in economic and military terms in the country. He also has participated in the series called Matarifa, the Slaughterer, that deals with the ties between Álvaro Uribe and paramilitarism. You have the floor, Daniel, whenever you'd like.
No me habilita el video.
I believe I'm unable to share my camera. I believe that I haven't been authorized. Okay, they'll get on this right away. Okay, yes, here I am now. All right. Good afternoon to you, to all of you, to our colleagues, to the organizers. I'm honored to be here and very thankful for being able to talk about this subject. Initially, when thanks to my lawyer in France very generously helped me, I didn't really know what to do. I'm very far away in miles. I'm in exile. What have I become from the time that the thugs were about to kill me? Have I not been able to practice? I studied law in El Externado, which is a liberal democratic institution in Colombia. And that's where I learned where laws come from, what they're there for. And then when I finished, I saw that those who legislated have actually used them for decades, instrumentalized them to ensure their own impunity. Having specialized as a criminal lawyer and given my personal experience, I understand that there is a whole apparatus in Colombia. Because in Colombia, unlike Mexico and in other Latin American countries and several countries around the world, the government does not have ties with drug trafficking or paramilitarism. For 3 decades, the Colombian government itself is a paramilitary and deals in drug trafficking. I have had several files in my own hands, and after writing down my conclusions, I've published, and without knowing how, I became a journalist, and the articles ran like wildfire around social networks. My publications translated into common language without any technical legal language or legalese or anthropology, describing how the Colombian elite is tied in to these practices, systematic killings of social leaders, journalists, and the massacring of entire communities, and actual genocide. And this falls upon our former president, Álvaro Uribe. And this was written into the series El Matarife, or The Slaughterer. That's what led me into exile. And there are 2 very powerful, the most powerful paramilitary groups that tried to put an end to my life. Nowadays, Juan Trujillo Cabrero, my partner, who is still in Colombia, is also at risk. This series has been aired for 2 different seasons now. But after these 2 years, we finally ended up in the Constitutional Court. And I find myself with the right-hand woman and ragdoll of both Álvaro Uribe and Iván Duque. All of this is entirely irregular. And finally, we have the names of those collaborating, knowing that this actually meant that they would be in the public light. And now, this has entirely turned around. The situation has entirely turned around. In other words, the legal system once again is functioning to defend impunity. I hope that the Constitutional Court will prevail in the rule of law and that the other magistrates will act accordingly. Currently, I am a subversive person with a computer and a camera that is harming the narco system. I have ideas. I'm propagating these ideas through journalism and through a series. And I am observing the law strictly in terms of this television series that has been awarded, and more than 60 million people have seen on the 2nd of February, we started filming another season. And Carlos Escobar also ties in to the series and the story. And Álvaro Uribe tapped my telephone and other very close people to me. And I want to specifically mention this here in this at this opportunity.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this tremendous experience that you shared. And now I'm going to give the floor to the last speaker, Joel Hernandez Garcia, who is from the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. He's been commissioner there since 2018, and he was re-elected for another further 4 years. Mr. Joel Hernandez has taken on the role of a rapporteur for Colombia for the Human Rights Commission. He studied law in Mexico and a master's at the New York University School of Law. He's a member of the United Nations International Criminal Justice Institute Board, and he was a member of the Inter-American Court from 2015 to 2018. We're very appreciative for having you here. Welcome, and when you like, you have the floor. We're afraid, yeah.
Sí, creo que ya estamos conectados.
Yes, I believe I'm connected. First of all, I would like to thank you for your generous invitation to be here celebrating the Day of the Lawyer in Danger. And above all, because I feel honored to speak to you about lawyers in danger in Colombia. I would like to start by expressing my solidarity to the defenders of human rights in Colombia, all those lawyers and all the victims of forced displacement, all the victims of the armed conflict, all the people who have seen their rights not complied with in the excessive use of force in the protests that took place in Colombia last year. So my solidarity to all of civil society as well. This is a very important moment for Colombia. The Inter-American Association of Human Rights, because we're talking about one of the bodies that play a fundamental role in modern states. This is a community that, with its work, builds the right kind of human rights defense. And Alfredo has already told us that any lawyer must, by nature, be one who defends human rights. The legal forum is of the essence for societies and for authorities as well, because under current circumstances, the states hold the authority to create law, and they can fashion law and shape law. That's why everybody that's involved, attorneys, prosecutors, and so on, help in writing down the rules. Now, this happens partially in parliaments, where lawyers are there technically and help the political bodies in order to guarantee the right kind of parliamentary procedure. But one of the major roles of lawyers is to question all this, how the laws are going to be enforced, for example. That is why the role played by lawyers is of the essence, again, because this helps to change aspects and correct aspects that are very important for the role we played by the state. That is why we in our association work for this, and what it has done over the years and made it possible to establish the criteria for inter-American human rights. And this is very important to us because law is good to avoid any conflict based on the courts. And the courts can be managed by the governments because there are lawyers that act in these courts, and indirectly they always have an influence on the policy of a state. The international framework of human rights at a universal level and an inter-American level was established historically on the basis of good processes. There were claims in the past that have led to a protection of rights because the international list of human rights is important to protect in various ways various groups that are underprivileged. For example, women, children, girls, people that are vulnerable and are discriminated against on the basis of race, asylum seekers, people that have been hurt because of other reasons. So all these rules have been established by many lawyers because the international idea was to defend the dignity of people on the basis of a very specific figure. Human rights, these recognize the dignity of people and establish rights that can be judged before a court, another mechanism. This does not mean that the world of human rights is reduced to law, but we cannot deny that all this has a relevant role to play. The bourgeoisie, for example, does not only work on the legislative side, but above all in the judiciary. In the international forum, lawyers play a major role in order to identify the violation of human rights and to identify the people that should be brought to justice. Many times this is a very difficult job. It's very difficult to do because, as you know, you need to overcome internal rules. A violation of human rights must first and foremost go before the local authorities, the government authorities, so that they can be held accountable and see what reparation can be made. So it is the state that has the main responsibility, that is mainly accountable to have real justice. Now, when that doesn't happen, then people can turn to the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights and others. Now, to turn to these institutions, well, this is a major challenge for lawyers. Above all, the lengthy procedure. Sometimes it's even 10 or 15 years that it takes for an appeal submitted to the Inter-American Commission, and the resolution of many problems that arise, and the fact that there are many tasks involved, for example, internal law, international law, and many other factors that come into play. The law in America has been up to the task because there are thousands of victims that have turned to the international bodies, and we have seen how rights have been complied with. Also, the law has made major progress in the recognition of the rights of people who suffer because of discrimination. Now, this link between the practice of law and the development defense of human rights mean a challenge to governments, to the states, for the groups and organizations that hold power in their territory at a given point in time. And in some circumstances, these challenges and temptations have meant that lawyers were at risk. And the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights has dwelt on this. For example, the report on Colombia, Truth, Justice and Reparation from 2013, the Commission identified many cases of attacks against lawyers, harassment because of their work on human rights, and called upon the government to investigate in an efficient manner all these facts and to punish and bring to justice those who are accountable. In 2020, the Inter-American Commission repeated its concern because of impunity in the case of attacks to people who were defending human rights, attacks which in some cases are targeting lawyers. These attacks against lawyers have many shapes and forms. These were detailed by the Diego Garcia, but there are other kinds of attacks which don't have an impact on the physical integrity of people, but do have an impact on their psychology, and this might trouble the practice of our profession. This is the case of vigilance, surveillance, the tapping, the bugging, and all sorts of abuse in exercising authority. For example, also checking documents. The lawyers, for example, are questioned personally in the practice of their profession, attacks for the clients that they represent, or the fact that internationally there are attacks on the authority of the state. The Inter-American Court, in the case of Indro Cárdenas versus Peru, the role of a lawyer, which is to be free, should be a fundamental element because the existence of that guarantees the rule of law in a democratic society. That was a quote. And in abusing their work when there are no reasons for punishing people, and this runs contrary to the rules of the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. States should try to prevent attacks and punish the people who are accountable. And there should be no hampering the practice of the law. In order to help lawyers, then it is important for governments to have the right public policies along these guidelines, and they should have efficient guidelines not only to punish but also to prevent where there is a risk. And this is something that has been periodically reviewed. The measures, the protection measures that are taken should protect the people that benefit from this and should not mean that these move away from everything that is right. In the case of Colombia, there is a method, a mechanism, a tool that guarantees protection, a mechanism that is enforced by the protection instrument. This is an instrument that the government has in its hands in order to prevent attacks against people who defend human rights, but also this guarantees that there should be an investigation when these events occur. I would like to conclude mentioning that the best way to design the right mechanisms, the right norms, is to do it, to have the authors of these be the people who really need to have a guarantee that the right steps are being taken. We should have the right strategies and that there should be the right impact. In other words, the work of lawyers is still going to be controversial. It is part of nature, but any difference and any gap must be filled institutionally, because without lawyers that are independent of power, all people would not be safe, because what we need a society that is not at risk of losing its freedoms. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Joel, por tus...
Thank you very much, Joel, for your very interesting words and also for your references to the practice of law. And lastly, I'll give the floor to Francesco Caia, President of the International Observatory for Lawyers at Risk, who will close this session. And on my side, thank you very, very much, and all of our support and encouragement to lawyers in Colombia. President Francesco, whenever you like.
Well, grazie, Alfredo.
Thank you, Alfredo. Thank you for this day, which is so interesting. I, too, would like to thank all the speakers at this conference of ours, because these speakers were really wonderful. And I thank the Colombian colleagues where their precious experience. They have enhanced our knowledge of the situation as it exists in Colombia. Before adjourning this conference, I would like to read out to you the requests addressed to governments and international institutions and the recommendations as a way to conclude our report. We are faced with a very serious situation. This is being faced by the lawyers for human rights in Colombia, and the organizations that are signatories raise the following requests and recommendations. First of all, we ask the Colombian state to comply with the fundamental principles of the United Nations on the role to be played by lawyers. And the state and the government of Colombia must urgently tackle the numerous aggressions and attacks on lawyers and guarantee the free and independent practice of the profession. The Colombian government must protect urgently the life of lawyers in Colombia and must guarantee their life, especially because the risks of those who run risks, especially the Principle 17 of the fundamental UN principles on the role to be played by lawyers. The Colombian state must investigate anything in an impartial way. The Colombian state must fight against stigmatizing Colombian lawyers when there are sensitive cases at stake in terms of human rights, in line with Principles 18 and 23 of the Fundamental Principles of the United Nations on the role to be played by lawyers. The Colombian state must consider the establishment and regulation of a professional institution that will safeguard the independence of lawyers and represent the interests of lawyers in Colombia. The European Union and its member states is encouraged, and the international community likewise is encouraged to use their relations in order to bring pressure to bear on the Colombian government so that the lawyers can be better protected. We ask the United States and other international institutions, and in particular the UN Special Rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers, and the situation of human rights. They should continue to concentrate on the defense of human rights in Colombia, and so that pressure will be brought to bear on the government to comply with all the UN principles. The lawyers all over the world and the bar associations are called upon to follow closely what is happening in Colombia, especially in particular for 2023, when there will be a periodical review. Journalists and international media are encouraged to investigate and report on the situation of lawyers for human rights in Colombia and to focus public attention throughout the world on the role played by the lawyers of human rights and the serious risks that they have to accept. Well, these are our requests, and these are our recommendations, and I adjourn this conference confirming our support of Colombian lawyers. This should not close now. This should continue, and all the signatories of this report should mean that we are not leaving Colombian lawyers out in the cold. And we are going to be shoulder to shoulder, close to all the colleagues that are threatened throughout the world. Thank you very much and have a good evening.